So Ryan was a very enthusiastic participant in this second place soccer team, lost 3-2 to a bunch of former NC2A athletes who were ringers, playing and beat them. But great job, guys. Really proud of you. Ryan's a funny guy. I learned from somebody in the cohort that Ryan, apparently when he was 11-ish years old, ran the second fastest 800 meter in the country for his age level. And I asked Ryan what his time was, and he goes, I don't know, I just ran. Ryan is a graduate of Rutgers and enthusiastic soccer player. Yes, we have soccer fields in New Jersey. You can look down your airplane, you see a bunch of concrete, there's a little green square, that's a soccer field. There's not that many of them, but Ryan spent a lot of time on those. And graduate of Rutgers University, just think of traffic and concrete and wind, and you have New Brunswick. And Ryan worked with a lot of the same faculty that I did when he was at Rutgers as an undergrad, when I was getting my PhD there several years ago. And so Ryan has just really been great to have in this cohort, and I really found it really pleasant to work with him on this project about environmental social governance in investing, because really I learned a lot. I wasn't aware that you could own Exxon but not Tesla and be good for the environment. So that kind of surprised me, and I think this project will show you a lot of surprising things about ESG investing. So Ryan, it's all you.
It was a sad loss finishing second. Okay, thank you, Corey, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. Today I'm going to be talking about ESG investing and some of the research that I've done onto it, and also be talking about some of the problems that I found and some potential solutions as well. When I first began this project, I was really interested in this idea of how we, as retail investors, could invest in companies that align with our values. I personally value climate change very much, and I wanted to answer the question, how could I figure out which companies were committed to tackling climate change in the most effective way? After doing some research, what I came upon was this idea of ESG investing, and ideally it's this way for investors to look at more than just financial metrics of a company. You could look at ESG indices to make a better decision of where you want to invest. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria. And so investors can look at these criteria more than just their financial impacts of companies and kind of make more tailored decisions. Environmental criteria refers to a way that a company handles environmental issues, kind of like referring to climate change and pollution. Social criteria refers to a company's handling of social issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion in its workplace. And governance refers to a company's handling of corporate oversight issues like corruption and board diversity. And so as an investor, you can essentially take all this information and tailor your investments as they align with your values. So if I personally value climate change very much, I can look at 2 different companies and see maybe that one is making investments into renewable energy projects or reforestation projects, and maybe they have a great workplace diversity, versus a company that makes massive investments into fossil fuel projects or deforestation projects. I, as an investor, could say, this first company is the one that I want to invest in. The second company is not where I want to put my money. And so this is ESG investing in its most ideal form. But after doing some research, I found that it didn't always work this way. Throughout my research, I found that there were 2 major problems with the way that ESG investing was being conducted. I found that there was this first problem with the way that companies are collecting and reporting on their ESG information. At the moment, if a company wants to disclose its ESG information, it is wholly voluntary. So not every company has to divulge their ESG information, but those that do can use any number of different frameworks to report their ESG information. And along those lines, because they're wholly voluntary, they can use those frameworks to any ability that they want. To kind of illustrate this topic a bit better, I've created a model to kind of elucidate this topic. So if you as an investor wanted to look at 4 different companies and invest with ESG in mind, you could look at a couple of these firms that disclose their ESG information, while not all firms disclose this ESG information. And those that do can utilize any number or any combination of different frameworks, and because they're wholly voluntary, These companies can use the frameworks to any ability or any degree that they like, so which could result in partial disclosures. What you might imagine is that these three companies have vastly dissimilar ESG reports, while some don't have ESG reports at all. So you might ask the question, how can you as an investor who probably has very limited time or maybe not the know-how to invest in, or go through these reports to make the most conscientious decision when deciding to invest with ESG in mind? Well, you can certainly delegate, and in fact, that's what a lot of investors do. So we could take these really difficult to compare ESG reports and we can delegate to an ESG rating agency that will do all the heavy lifting, that will look into these reports and attribute really handy, really easy to look at ESG ratings or scores. And you as an investor could see a rating of a D and say, that's not really where I want to put my money. Or you could see a rating of an A and you could say, well, that is where I want to put my money. So this kind of gets into our second problem, although because inherently, by not having easily comparable ESG reports, you inherently have to trust these ESG rating agencies to deliver quality disclosure or very comparable ESG ratings. So the second problem that I found is with how those ESG data agencies are packaging and selling their data to investors. On the screen, I've listed the top 10 holdings of the S&P 500 and the S&P 500 ESG index. What you might notice is that there is considerable overlap between the two. What's interesting is that these companies are some of the largest and most wealthy companies, but also some of the most polluting and known to have considerable workplace violations between them. You might ask the question, how can a company like Amazon, who has been known to mistreat its workers and contribute massively to emissions, be remotely considered for an ESG list? And throughout my research, what I found is that a lot of ESG agencies aren't giving these high ESG ratings because of a company's impact on society, but more so because of society's impact on those companies. In other words, many agencies are only giving high scores to companies that are the least risky investments. And by looking at these two figures, you might have noticed something else. To add to the confusion, as Corey kind of mentioned earlier, ExxonMobil is seen to be ESG friendly, whereas a company that we might associate with being good for the environment, although that's debatable, Tesla, was kicked off of the ESG index. Now, if you know anything about Elon Musk or been keeping up with the news recently, he doesn't necessarily go quiet on these issues. And so he tweeted in his fury, essentially, Tesla was knocked off the list because the S&P 500 found that there were counts of workplace violation and racism at some of its factories in California. While I think this is a really serious issue, I think we should be asking the question, why are we not holding all these corporations accountable in the same way? If Amazon has counts of workplace violations, why are they not being taken off these lists? And if Exxon is contributing massively to climate change, why are they not being held accountable despite clearly going against investor values? There's also this problem of misleading naming schemes. So on the left, I have BlackRock's iShares Low Carbon ETF and American Century's Sustainable Equity ETF. Now, despite my trying to look for definitions for what low carbon or sustainable equity means, I couldn't necessarily find that. And you might notice that they also look remarkably similar to the previous lists, despite being sold in two completely different ways. So these naming schemes make investors think that they're getting a different product, but they're in fact very similar. And you as an investor could see low carbon and make an investment when in fact your investments aren't necessarily aligning with your values. So we have two major problems with ESG investing, and that refers to the data collection and reporting by the companies, but as well as the packaging and selling of that data by ESG agencies. And so we have to kind of ask the question, is there some solution to this problem? And while I don't necessarily think that there's a silver bullet to this issue, I do think that there is room for a possible solution. Earlier this year, and in fact what I based most of my presentation on, or project on, was earlier this year, the Securities and Exchange Commission published a proposed rule to standardize and enhance climate-related risk disclosures. And ideally, this rule offers greater transparencies for investors to see a company's carbon emissions and how companies are being affected by climate change. And I think this rule is really interesting because not only does it influence how corporations are thinking about and acting on climate change, but it offers some small-scale solution to improving ESG investing. So what I've done for my project is pose this question, how could this rule be used to improve ESG for more than just climate-related risks? So if we take my model out for a spin again, the SEC could require companies to require them to disclose their climate-related risks. Now, that solves the first issue of voluntary reporting. And the SEC could require companies to report using standardized frameworks to the full extent possible. So that solves our second issue of partial reporting and disparate framework use. Ultimately, the end goal is to have 4 easily comparable climate reports that investors can look at and analyze very clearly to make the most conscientious decision. So I believe that this rule, which is largely about climate-related risks, could certainly be scaled up to improve ESG disclosures across the board. Ultimately, I believe that higher quality data disclosures are almost always a positive. It can allow investors to have greater accountability. If you can see what a corporation is doing, you can, in effect, go into that corporation and demand change from them. But as well, it also offers investors more solutions for investing. If you can see that some company doesn't necessarily align with your values, you can easily go and compare other reports and find other companies that you might want to invest in. And ultimately, enhanced and standardized data can benefit upstream ESG. And what I mean by that is standardization can improve ESG data, how ESG agencies are collecting their data, but it can also allow investors to hold those ESG agencies more accountable. And to put that into perspective, what I mean by this is now if we utilize this model again, we have very easily comparable ESG reports that could improve how ESG rating agencies are looking at these reports and improve the ratings that they give off. But it also improves the fact that if we bring this back to Exxon and Tesla, if I dispute some of the ratings that I'm seeing, I can easily now dig through these more comparable reports and hold those rating agencies accountable because I know what I'm looking at. So ultimately, this rule is beneficial for how investors interact with companies, but it also impacts how we can hold those agencies that sell that data much more accountable. So in order to answer the question of how we can build a better ESG system and how this rule can get us there, in my analysis, I've looked at how the proposed rule was built, what the proposed rule could require, as well as how could we further build off of this rule. So the rule was built utilizing 2 very popular frameworks. The first is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And these were utilized by the SEC for 3 distinct reasons. Number 1 is that they are widely used by a lot of companies in the United States, which should ultimately reduce compliance stress. If a lot of companies are very familiar with these frameworks and do disclose their climate-related risks within these frameworks, maybe they don't do it to the full extent possible, but at least they're familiar with them. So the SEC isn't imposing any new regulation on them. As well, they're also internationally recognized, which means if a company in the United States is disclosing their climate-related risks, you can easily compare that to somewhere in the EU or elsewhere. As well, they provide really sufficient and high-quality information for investors. And what those disclosures look like are something like this. Using the TCFD's framework, the SEC could require companies to disclose disclosures related to impact disclosures, or the what and the where. What are a company's climate-related risks and where are they likely to affect them? Risk management disclosures, or the how. How is a company identifying those risks and how are they mitigating those risks? Governance disclosures, or the who is being put in charge of managing these risks? And financial disclosures, or the how much. How much is a climate-related risk likely to cost your company? And utilizing the Greenhouse Gas Protocols framework, the SEC could require companies to disclose information related to a company's greenhouse gas emissions, as well as targets and goals to reduce their carbon emissions. So some of the key points that I want to hammer home are that this is just using climate-related ESG disclosures. But what if we use the same idea for disclosures that covered all of the bases, like using ESG frameworks that covered broader topics rather than just climate change? So in my analysis, I've identified 2 existing and very popular frameworks that could be used in the same fashion as the previous frameworks that I just talked about. There's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or the SASB, which offers guidance for companies on what ESG measures they should report for investors, as well as the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI, which tells companies how to measure and report those ESG criteria. And using the same underpinnings, these could be used as widely used frameworks that are internationally recognized, and they also provide really sufficient data disclosures. So if this is what our proposed rule is looking like, and the underpinnings of that are widely used, internationally recognized, and they offer sufficient data disclosures, then the SEC could give investors accurate and comparable disclosures of their climate-related risks. What I could recommend to the SEC is to utilize the SASB and the GRI frameworks using those same underpinnings of widely used, internationally recognized, and sufficient data disclosures to give investors accurate and comparable disclosures of ESG information. And while I'm not necessarily advocating that all companies need to disclose their ESG information, I believe that the companies that want to play the ESG game should abide by standardized rules and procedures, and I ultimately believe that this is the pathway forward for them to do that. So some of my recommendations for the SEC is to address any of the gaps in the proposed rule. At the moment, the proposed rule is not finalized, so the comment period is still open for them, and I hope to give some recommendations to the SEC for how to improve that proposed rule. And as well, I think that to build on that further, the SEC should begin to standardize ESG disclosures utilizing those GRI and SASB frameworks as soon as possible, because ESG investing is growing and is a massively growing field, and the chances for investors to be misled will only grow with a lack of regulation in the future. And so ultimately, my key takeaways for all of you today is that ESG investing is flawed in its current iterations, but I believe that the SEC proposed rule offers some small-scale solution despite not being a silver bullet to improving it. And ultimately, improving data disclosures could improve accountability. If we can see what companies are doing, we can more easily hold them accountable. And finally, for all of you, if you plan to invest with ESG in mind, to be cautious and critical of ESG investing. It is a constantly evolving field that is constantly growing, and there are plenty of ways for investors to be misled at the current moment. So if you plan on investing with ESG in mind, be very cautious. And just to finish up here, I'd like to thank my cohort. I couldn't have done this without you, and just moving across the country and being welcomed by a family so loving as you guys was amazing. And thank you to all of my friends and family and Dr. Corey Gabriel for allowing me to explore some new idea that I didn't. Thank you, Corey. Thank you.
Great presentation and terrific topic. I'm Julia Brown.
Thank you for your wonderful donations to everyone here.
I completely agree that we would benefit from standardization in ESG reporting. As you know, historically, it's been done predominantly by the largest companies, mm-hmm. and it's rapidly being adopted by a broader set of companies. And you're closer to the SEC proposal than I am, no doubt, but I believe they have proposed it for all public companies. Mm-hmm. And I'm concerned about the regulatory burden that would create for the smaller ones. I wonder if you could address that point.
Yeah, so there actually is, they considered that in the SEC proposed rule, and it's really interesting because I think, so they've added kind of lagged requirements for, so let me just start by saying it's not a finalized rule at the moment, so it's up in the air whether or not they could change it. But they've included a portion for larger companies to, if it is finalized, to comply with the SEC proposed rule sooner than smaller companies. Essentially, smaller companies could be required to disclose this in 2025 or later, whereas larger companies could be required to disclose it in a few years, or 2023.
That would still impose the burden on all of them.
Yeah. So they're hoping that that there's this market response, and the big guys lead the small guys. And so the notion is, like, you will have to disclose your climate-related risks. It's just learn from the big guys or the big corporations. So I know that there are kind of some, like stresses, but it's coming, and I think that they have to prepare for it. Yeah.
Hi, another question. In one of your earliest slides, you pointed out there's this ESG, they're ESG firms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rating agencies, yeah.
The agencies, right.
Yeah.
So they and their product is effectively what is sort of considered a mutual fund, and in a way, right? It's a collection, it's a group of, a chunk of sort of risk mitigated companies that taken together overwhelmingly have a positive ESG score or whatever. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, a lot of rating agencies offer a lot of different products, so you could get just simple ratings off of certain companies, but you could also get ratings on like funds and certain things, and they can make funds for you.
Okay, so given that is there? I don't know what.
Yeah.
Well, I guess to try to get to the question, is there, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding this, but is there an angle that the SEC might have to take a look at that level, rather than going right to the companies and saying, hey, companies, you need to put forth this information. I agree that sounds totally required. You've made a great point of that. But is there something perhaps extendable to the ESG agencies that the SEC could say, hey, if you're doing this bundling of stuff, you need to like put out a whole bunch of notifications and let the investors know that highlight the ones that are actually negative for that.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the most interesting things that I loved about this project is that it's constantly evolving. And as I was doing this project, the SEC announced another proposed rule to actually standardize or at least elucidate some of those like naming structures and things like that. So I think that rule came out on May 25th, and it's currently an open comment period for companies to, or ESG rating agencies to comment on it and such. But so yes, they are working on it, and it's one of the reasons why I love this topic, because it's so constantly evolving and there's just new things coming out basically every day. It makes my life tough, but it's really interesting to see. So yes, they are working on that.